Hello everyone, my name is Rodriguez Smith, and I want to apologize. I'm recording this from my phone. I have tried several laptops. I've tried my desktop here at home, I tried my desktop at work, and I cannot get my videos to upload. And so earlier today I had the idea that, okay, well maybe I could try to record it from my phone and download the Canvas mobile app. But the video that I had to submit to Dr. Delap was recorded straight from the Canvas webcam, and it just had to be me talking about it. So I hope he can forgive me for that. But I have had a hard time submitting files into Canvas, so I don't know if something's going on with it. So I hope you all enjoy this. I hope it comes in clear. Let me try to adjust this for you all. Okay. So I chose to do my paper on the American-Soviet space race. And the reason why is because I think that the greatest technological advancements take place during this time. The world truly saw a quantum leap in technological advancement. And so my approach to this paper was different than most that I've written in the past, primarily because it was longer. And so I really wanted to drive home my points. And so I came up with a question chart or list. And the biggest question was, what is the goal of the paper? And so I followed that question up with several sub-questions. We had to start with, where did the idea of space travel even come from? Which later on, from a source, I realized that space travel has always been an interest of man. It was just a matter of knowing how to do it. But in the space race, who were the countries involved? Okay, yes, we know that the United States and the Soviet Union were the two countries, but why those two? Why did it end up being between those two? And the other question was, why were they both so confident that it could be done? What role did Germany play? And that is an all-important question. That is one that always seems to be forgotten when you talk about the space race. And then we have how the Cold War fueled this competition between the two countries. Who determined the winner and what determined the winner? And what's the purpose of going to space? So let's jump right into this, y'all. Right here, I have a theoretical model, basically just putting a bunch of equations together. And this one is theoretical in approach. And the reason I did that is because I wanted to give an example of early space interest. Now, we had an American scientist and we had a Soviet scientist who both had their own rockets. They did it in different ways, but they could never quite get to space. And so because they never got to space, the idea of space travel was theoretical rather than actual possibility. So let's continue to go forward from there. Who were the countries involved in the competition? And we know that it was the United States and the Soviet Union. And the reason why is because of what happened in World War II. And so I asked the question, where did they get the knowledge from? And we know now that they got it from Germany. Germany was working on things that the rest of the world didn't even know how to ask. And so it was important for them to establish themselves in space, because the country that could establish themselves in space would be the country that would eventually lead the world. Why? Because they would be seen as a leader in innovation and technology, and the rest of the world would follow suit because they'd want to know how to do it for themselves, and they'd come to that country, leading that country to have the influence globally. But they got that information from the Germans, and the Germans got it from the other countries, or pieces of it from countries that they attacked and eventually took over, and they encouraged their scientists to go a little bit heavier on it. So, what did they learn during the war? Well, they learned that Germany had a super weapon that put the fear of God into the world. And what I mean by that is this. The German scientists, the Nazi scientists, Werner von Braun in particular, designed a rocket that was used as a weapon. This thing was precise in striking its targets. It could travel extremely far. It traveled about 500 miles. So you can only imagine that an accurate weapon that could travel that far scaring the region. So if you were a neighboring country or a country that might have been on the other side of the country that was close to Germany, but you were within 500 miles, you kind of lived in fear because you didn't know what the German dictator would do in the process. Well, as they did that, this thing could also travel at hypersonic speeds. So it went well above 3,200 miles per hour. And it also did something that really scared the world because it could go above the Earth's atmosphere and I had a couple of sources that went back and forth on this, and it was just a matter of what you believed. Some people said that the V2 rocket had the ability to go into space because it went above the Earth's atmosphere. They called it at the edge of space. But then you had another set of scientists that argued that it did not make it into space because it did not reach what we call lower Earth orbit. So the Germans, they really contributed early on to the American space program, to the Soviet space program. And it wasn't directly, but when you talk about Germany's role, when they worked on this rocket, Germany inadvertently contributed to both space programs because the Americans and the Soviets saw that and they realized that it was possible to escape the Earth's atmosphere and to possibly establish themselves into space. And that would give them a strategic advantage, militarily speaking. So Germany really kicked off the space program, even though that was never in their intentions in the 1930s. And the reason Germany was able to do that, okay, Germany throughout its history was constantly involved in some sort of conflict, whether they were Prussia, when they were referred to as the Franks, or the Kingdom of Germania, the Holy Roman Empire. Germany was constantly involved in something. And so when you're constantly in conflict, you have to update your weaponry. You have to update your technology. Why? Because you either want to break even with who you're fighting or you want an advantage. And so Germany was able to accomplish a lot. And when the madman Adolf Hitler took over and he pushed them in a direction that the world just wasn't quite up to speed with. Now, we have this period that we call the Cold War. And with the Cold War, it all began at the end of World War II. Now, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union came up with a temporary alliance. Why? Because they needed to stop Germany. And the Soviets probably wouldn't have had much interest in it had Adolf Hitler not turned on them. Well, while that happened, the Allies, with the exception of the Soviets, they were pretty close, but they didn't trust Russia or the Soviet Union because they had human rights violations and they were a communist nation, and America was a capitalistic nation. So This automatically created distrust and tension between the two countries, and the Americans really kicked things off when they dropped the nuclear weapons on Japan. And so that really kind of sparked a new type of fear and distrust between the two countries, especially once the Soviets began developing their own. But in my paper, I make the argument, and I had several sources to back it up, that the Cold War, in order to push us forward technology-wise, it was sort of necessary, even though for the most part it was an unnecessary thing. It's contradictory in nature, what I'm talking about here. Without the Cold War, we're not fueled, we're not as motivated to beat Russia or the Soviets because there would have been no tension. And so it would have been just kind of a gradual process that we would have been working on in secret. But then when they launched Sputnik 1, that really sped things up. And that really fueled this Cold War. So I talk about in this at great lengths about how the Cold War really contributed and fueled this competition. But that leads me to the next thing. Once the Soviets really kicked off things on October 4th of 1957 with the launch of Sputnik 1, the Soviets, if you looked at this competition just straight on, and we gave it a point for every event that was done first by a country, then you could see the Soviet Union dominated the United States. And there's a reason for that. And I didn't elaborate as much in my paper as I should have, not looking back on it now. But the reason why is because the Soviet Union's public opinion, they didn't really challenge their government. And the reason why they didn't do that is because we went into Germany to fight a bad guy in Adolf Hitler. But an argument can be made that Joseph Stalin was equally, if not worse, than Adolf Hitler. And I know that's not often talked about, but he was responsible for killing off more of his own people than Adolf Hitler had done in Germany. And so when they were able to push in a way that the American public would have pushed back on their government. So the Soviet Union were able to push through, and they were able to make mistakes along the way that the Americans could not do, because the American public opinion truly matters. We had free and fair elections to choose our people, as opposed to what the Soviets did. They did not. So if you wanted to say the United States won, it's probably because of that lunar landing with Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin. As of today, here in 2024, the United States is still the only country to ever have achieved that. And as a result, that's why many view us as the winner. And so I say the winner is based on your perspective. Why? Because as you saw before with the slide before, if we counted up the events, then the Soviets dominated. They won. But if we looked and went based on the major events, then the Americans won, because there were things that we were able to accomplish that the Soviets could not. For instance, when they launched Sputnik 1 and then eventually Sputnik 2, they could only last for about 3 months. But when the Americans launched Explorer 1, it lasted 12 years before it burned up into our atmosphere. So I go into great lengths about who the winner is, because the American textbook does not make it clear, as they should, that there was really no formal competition. This was not some happy moment. In fact, this was probably the scariest time in modern history, primarily because tensions were so high. And when the Soviets launched Sputnik 1, that put the fear of God in America and her allies. And when the Americans got to the moon first and actually landed, that actually breathed a sigh of relief in those same countries that would have cheered against Russia. So the winner is based on your perception. There is no clear-cut winner because there was never any formal announcement of a competition. And again, if there was and it was scored based off of events done first, then the Americans would have lost because of the rules and regulations here. And they had rules and regulations that Russia did not have to adhere to. And this leads me to the next part, which is, why do we continue to go to space? A lot of people ask this question, and according to a great deal of my sources, it's because there are great benefits to the life that is here on Earth. They're able to test different medicines, different viruses, different bacteria up there that they couldn't do here on Earth. And they can do it in zero gravity, which gives them a different perspective. And to understand the universe, we need to know how things came about. It's important for us to see what's going on in the universe to understand our own planet. And the last bullet point that I put was, it was for our own protection. And the reason I put that is because as we learn more about space, we began to realize that there are these giant space rocks that are flying out there, meteors, asteroids, comets, and every once in a while they do come into contact with a celestial body. And the Earth is no stranger to it. And because when you think about it, an asteroid took out the dinosaurs. Some major space object hit the Earth to form the moon. And so I talk about that in my paper because it is important. Most people think that astronauts go up there just to be spacemen and women, but they're not that. They think that same about cosmonauts, the Soviets version of astronauts, but they're not. These people are doctors, they're scientists, they're engineers, they're mathematicians, they're politicians, and any other major field that you can think of. These people are some of the most brilliant people that you'll ever have the opportunity to meet if you meet one. And I think that was important to put into the paper because of the things that they do for us. We benefit greatly here today. The launch of Sputnik 1 kicked off things, but we wouldn't have had that opportunity had it not been for the Germans' V2 rocket. The launch of that artificial satellite in 1957 contributes to the fact that I can talk to you remotely here today. The fact that you can get a picture, a good quality picture on your TV through an invisible force that we can't see because most people have moved on to a wireless cable network. And so the work that these men and women do outer space, it matters. It is important. And I thought that it was important to highlight that in this paper because we benefit greatly today from the work that they started years ago. And so I'm going to show a couple of pictures of major events that took place during the Great Space Race because I think that this is important. And the reason why I think it's important is because, again, there are things that was done for us on our behalf, sacrifices that were made, mistakes that were made, just for us to have an opportunity to enjoy life, the qualities of life, a little bit more. The launch of Sputnik 1 and Sputnik 2. If you look over here, you have Sputnik 1. This was launched October 4th, 1957. a little bit of time after that, Sputnik 2 was launched, where they captured a street dog by the name of Laika. And Moscow sent her out of space, which sparked questions outside of Russia about the ethical use of animals in testing. Because Laika was sent out of space, this was not challenged inside the Soviet Union, by the way. Again, they were an oppressive regime, so people dared not put themselves in that type of danger. But she was sent out of space with the idea of sending her with 7 days worth of food, water, and oxygen. Unfortunately, something broke off and a thermal panel broke along the way up. So we found out on a dying Soviet scientist's bed that Laika only lasted about 2 to 3 hours in space. Because of that, the cabin got too hot, about 108 degrees, and she succumbed fairly quickly to the heat. So we have the first man in space. Again, this would have been a major event for the people back then. Now we do it routinely. And most importantly, the most iconic scene known to man, the lunar landing. Again, I talked about in this paper how the Americans not only did it once, we did it multiple times, and we continue to be the only country on Earth to have ever actually put people on another celestial body. And as a result of that major accomplishment that no one else in the world can do, we got to be called the leader of the free world. So I hope you enjoyed this. I thoroughly enjoyed writing this paper. I thought it was just a pretty awesome experience. It was a long and tedious process, but it was a wonderful experience. And in fact, in writing this paper, I actually learned a lot more than I thought I actually knew about the space race. So I hope you all enjoyed this. I've taken enough of your time. Y'all have a wonderful one. I look forward to hearing your responses. Thank you.